Hello listeners, I've been a little bit busy for the past few days, which is why I haven't uploaded any more talks in a little while. But this is going to be the first of a two-part series on the pros and cons of living in Taiwan. So the other part should be up tomorrow. It's not going to involve me talking about anything sort of autobiographical in terms of how I came to be here, why I'm here, what I do, all that sort of stuff. I might save those details for another time. This particular talk is purely going to be about the pros of living in Taiwan. And the first pro that I have is the cheap cost of living. If you live outside of Taipei, you can quite easily get by on $1,000 per month. You can certainly earn $1,000 very easily in Taiwan. You should be able to earn probably twice that as an English teacher, maybe even more, depending on what you do and where you do it and so on. But anyway, you can definitely live off $1,000 a month. And of course, if you have some other source of income, if you're retired or about to be retired, or you have some other passive income, or you work remotely or something like that, you can live very well here on just $1,000 per month. Taipei is more expensive though, primarily because of accommodation. Not just because of accommodation, but primarily because of accommodation. There's a big housing bubble, and a lot of people are moving from other parts of Taiwan to Taipei, and the places don't tend to be very big. Most people don't live in houses, proper houses in Taipei. They live in apartments, and those are often quite small and expensive. And they're even more expensive to buy relative to renting. But outside of Taipei, you can, in a major city, you can find a two-bedroom apartment for $500 quite easily. Some foreigners end up paying more than that because they tend to want to live in certain areas and congregate together, and I think the landlords there know that and charge accordingly. But if you're willing to live a little way away from those other foreigners, then you can find some pretty good deals. And outside of cities, if you live in a town, you can find a place, even a full house for $200-300 a month. I've lived in a couple of places that were pretty old and small, but nevertheless I only paid $100 a month for those places. So accommodation is quite reasonable the farther away you get from Taipei. Other things are pretty cheap as well. I won't go into a full cost breakdown. I might do that another time, maybe not. But as I said, approximately $1,000 a month is enough to live off quite comfortably. Of course, you won't be going out partying, and you won't be eating at fancy restaurants and so on for that. But you can get by quite easily on $1,000 a month. What's next? All right, low barriers to entry for starting a business. It's actually quite a good option to set up a business here. That will cost about $2,000 to do all of the paperwork and safety checks and so on. And it takes about 2 months to do it, and it's fairly straightforward. You might have to get someone to help you, but it's fairly straightforward, and I believe foreigners can do it by themselves. I'm married, so it's a little bit different for me. But nevertheless, it's pretty easy to set up a business here. Of course, as to what you would do, if you don't have very strong language skills, then you might have some problems in terms of actually running a business, but it's easy to set up. We set up one of our two businesses for, I think it was a bit more than $3,000, including furniture and some other things, a sign as well, I think. So that can be quite a good option. Labour is cheap as well. Minimum wage is 130 Taiwanese dollars, and it's about 1 to 30, so it's a bit more than $4 per hour to hire someone here. And people, they're not necessarily they don't necessarily show initiative and things like that, but they'll work hard and they won't sort of give you attitude and so on. That's a real pro here. Workers, whilst they may not necessarily show initiative, you certainly won't get all the hassles that you get from many Western employees. And then after you set your business up, the government basically leaves you alone. Occasionally you'll get a letter, or they might want to come and see something, but generally speaking they just leave you alone, which is really nice. That's very refreshing. My father ran a business in Australia for 23 years, and the amount of nonsense he had to go through in his business was colossal, really. You won't have that here in Taiwan if you set up a business. And that leads on to tax rates. The personal tax rate in Taiwan is on a so-called progressive scale, but the rates are much lower than in other countries. Most Taiwanese end up paying about 5% tax. Even if they're in one of the higher brackets, they can get all sorts of deductions and so on. As a foreigner, generally speaking, you'll pay a bit more than that. The next bracket is 12%, up from the lowest bracket, and you won't really get deductions and so on, generally speaking. And there's also one slight little thing with how foreigners are taxed. For the first year that they're in Taiwan, that basically what happens is for the first 183 days, they're taxed, I think it's 18 or 20%, it's around that level. They're taxed at that rate for the first 183 days. So, if they come on the 1st of January, basically in the middle of the year, from that point onwards, they get taxed at the normal rate. Now, if they came sort of midway through the year, they might be taxed at that rate for the whole year, or the first 183 days, every day after that they get taxed at their normal rate. So if they spend 193 days here, the last 10 will be taxed at a different rate. And if they end up paying too much tax, they get it back, basically. If that 20% is more than they should be paying, then they get it back, basically, at the end of the calendar year. And then after that, for subsequent years, foreigners just get taxed at their normal rate for the entire year, each year. So personal tax rates are pretty low, and you have to pay two other things. There's sort of labour insurance, workers' insurance, which is not very much. I think it's only, I can't remember exactly, I think it's only about $15, $20, something like that per month. And then there's also a contribution to the medical system. Again, it's not very much. I think for a single person, it probably only comes to about 1,000 or 1,500 Taiwanese dollars. So you divide that by 30, those two things. So, $30 to $50, something like that. Most of it's paid for by the employer, and the government subsidises it as well. And I'll actually talk about the medical system later on in this talk. It's definitely worth paying that money. I don't begrudge paying that at all. And then business tax rates. There's sort of an amount you need to earn in a business before you get taxed. And that's fairly high, actually, for most businesses. So most businesses never pay it. And actually, there are quite a few illegal businesses in Taiwan. A lot of people run businesses illegally. And the government doesn't really hassle them because it understands that they need to earn a living. And so it would be to no one's advantage to put those people out of business. They're not running a nanny state here, which is really good. And so, they just sort of leave people alone to do what they do in their business, as long as they're not, poisoning people or something like that. And most people will never earn enough in their businesses to pay the tax rate. The tax rate apparently is 17%. And there are all sorts of interesting kind of little caveats and so on it. So even people who might have to pay more don't. So that's really good as well. It's a good place to run a business, and tons of Taiwanese run small businesses. What have I got next? All right, yeah, so leading on from that, there is a general live and let live attitude in Taiwan. Firstly, from the government. The government largely leaves you alone, which is actually really refreshing compared to the West, where all levels of government, from federal to state to local, seem to be in your face over anything and everything. They're not like that here at all. They generally leave you alone. And there are all sorts of sort of crazy things. Sometimes it's a bit rough and ready, but they just don't seem to have this obsession with micromanaging people. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So a few years ago, one of my friends went through the security check at the airport with a 1 litre bottle of sunscreen. And they stopped him and they said something, and he just gave them some sort of story about how he had sensitive skin or something, and so they just waved him through. It could never, the procedures. Now, I'm old enough to remember before they had these procedures in the West, and how farcical it is when they're stopping people from taking on a bottle that has a quarter of a litre of water, all this sort of nonsense that they go on with in the West now, and also things like where I'm from, which is Melbourne in Australia. In Melbourne, there are a couple of local councils that have some crazy rules. There's one apparently that where you're only allowed to have 2 different colours for the roof of your house. I don't know what they are. Let's say they're black and terracotta red, for instance. If you wanted to have exactly the same tile, but in brown, for instance, you wouldn't be allowed to do that in that local council. And I believe there's also at least one local council where if you want to have more than 2 dogs, not only do you have to register the dogs, as you do with every dog, but you actually have to ask for permission to get a 3rd dog. You have to go to them and say, I want to have a 3rd dog. Please, may I have a 3rd dog? Which I think is absolutely ridiculous. But, that's the sort of the nanny state of the West. And as I said, I'm old enough to remember how things were different. I was 13 when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. And, we had won the Cold War. The sort of the West, as led by the US, we had won the Cold War. The good guys, the righteous had won. We were free. Those other places weren't free. They were going to become free. Rah, rah, rah. And yet, here we are, 26 years on. It doesn't seem to have worked out that way. So, it's very refreshing, actually, coming to Taiwan where the government isn't, in your face for every silly little thing. Stopping people from taking nail clippers on aeroplanes, for God's sake. And people, actually, when they interact with one another, have a pretty live and let live attitude. So there are disadvantages to that sometimes. People, they don't really get the concept of noise pollution a lot of the time, and some other things like that. It can be, sometimes people can get on your nerves, but people basically just roll with it. They say, well, maybe he's getting on my nerves, but last week I was getting on his nerves, and people just sort of roll with it, and they're not in your face. One thing that I really notice about Australian culture, and I noticed it also about British culture when I lived in the UK, and I think it's kind of a Western thing, is that people are very ready to have conflicts with one another. They're very ready to confront each other about a perceived slight or about what they deem to be their rights, and have a go at other people. They're not like that here at all. People are very avoidant of confrontation. Now, that means sometimes they can be kind of passive-aggressive. It's not all roses, of course. But generally speaking, they don't like conflict here, which is really refreshing. You don't get people sort of getting really on your back about stuff. That's really nice in Taiwan. And following on from that is social harmony. There are very complex social mores in Taiwan, as there are for pretty much every society. Mostly they won't apply to you as a foreigner if you come to Taiwan. They generally won't apply to you. And Taiwanese are actually pretty easygoing. If you do commit a faux pas, as long as you're not deliberately trying to annoy someone or upset someone, people will generally roll with it, and they might not even say anything, or if they do, they'll tell you at some later point rather than embarrassing you in front of people and so on. Or they'll laugh it off. You know, they're very easygoing in that regard. Which is quite nice. And Taiwan is a largely mono-ethnic society. It's a little bit more complex than saying it's a mono-ethnic society. There are different distinctions between people who are Han Chinese, who are the overwhelming majority of people here. But, you know, it's sort of like splitting hairs, really. There are some Taiwanese Aborigines, Polynesian people, but they're only a couple of percent, and really they're very, I mean, they're not restricted by law or anything, but just in terms of where they want to live and so on, and where they're from, they tend to be restricted to the southeast and the east of Taiwan. You don't really see them in other parts of Taiwan, though their culture is very big on the east coast. You'll see it everywhere if you go there. But basically it's a mono-ethnic society. Even in terms of foreigners, they do have a lot of Southeast Asians here, and sort of two categories of Southeast Asians. One is wives of often farmers in rural areas, who are generally Vietnamese, sometimes other Southeast Asians, sometimes mainland Chinese, but predominantly Vietnamese. And then there's a whole group of Southeast Asians who work here in factories as nannies, home carers for elderly people and so on. But all of those people are expected to assimilate, or if they're not here for the long term, then to basically just behave themselves. And so it is really mono-ethnic, and there aren't that many Westerners here. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's only 10,000 or so, something like that. It's not that many, actually. So it is really mono-ethnic, and you know, we're always sort of berated about the benefits, the enriching benefits of diversity in the West, but you know, they haven't been enriched by diversity here. You know, no one's chopping off heads, no one's blowing anyone up. You know, they haven't. You know, unfortunately for them, they haven't been enriched by the benefits of the presence of the religion of peace, for instance. So you know, it's very nice here actually, and I'll talk about safety in a little while. But basically, because it's mono-ethnic, there aren't all these tensions. You don't have these different ethnic groups at each other's throats all the time, and this sort of shadow of race war or something like that, like is building in the US and Europe at the moment. That's really nice, and I'm an ethnic minority in Taiwan, but I actually really like that because there are so few of us here. It's all cool, you know. We're almost a novelty actually. Whereas, you know, if we were 10% of the population or 20% of the population or something, there'd be tensions there, right? Because, you know, you'd have all these white guys agitating for their rights, because, I mean, that's especially a very white thing, right? You know, getting people's faces about their rights, you know, and social justice and all this nonsense, right? You'd have all these white guys doing that, and then the locals would say, hey, you know, come on, back off, right? But that's not the case. So it's actually a very calm society. There's a lot of social harmony. And a lot of that also comes from their sort of deep cultural roots. If you think about the West has two traditions. There's the Christian tradition, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, whatever you want to call it, and there's the Greek tradition. And if you take the sort of the two seminal figures in those traditions, they would be Jesus Christ and Socrates. Both of those people got in a lot of trouble for rocking the boat. And ever since, people have been following their example. It's very much part of Western culture to rock the boat and to challenge authority and to say, you know, hey, we don't like what's going on here. Let's reform this. That's not really the case in Taiwan. They're very Confucian. They're very much into hierarchy, social order, social harmony, and so on. They don't like it when people rock the boat at all, actually. And of course there are downsides to that, but the upside is that people more or less get along, at least on the surface. And this leads on to the people. There are a lot, and politeness. People are generally very polite, aside from a few old people. People are extremely polite here. They're very deferential, and you'll get good service if you go into a restaurant or into a convenience store or something like that. People might freak out a little bit because they're too shy, they don't speak English well, but they won't give you attitude as a foreigner. They're very welcoming. A lot of people just come and help you with things if they see that you're lost or something like that. People come and help you, and they don't expect anything in return. And bureaucrats and ticket salesmen or conductors for trains, all of these kinds of people in the public sector are actually incredibly helpful and polite. Sort of the opposite stereotype to how they are in the West, which is really nice. It's really refreshing. A topic I won't really talk about for very long is the women here. There are lots of beautiful feminine women. I ended up marrying one, so that's sort of my endorsement of Taiwanese women. And then my next topic is safety. There is crime here, and I looked up the international rates of homicide, intentional homicide for different countries. I think, if I remember correctly, Taiwan is on a par with the US. It's higher than Australia. But I think a lot of the crime, violent crime, that happens here happens behind closed doors. It's either within families or it might be something to do with organised crime. But basically, as an ordinary person, and especially as a foreigner, you won't really encounter that unless you go looking for it. It seems to be an extremely safe society. I've never walked into any particular place and thought, this is an unsafe neighbourhood, or this is an odd town, people are looking at me in a funny way. I've certainly encountered those kinds of places in Australia on many occasions, and there are parts of Melbourne I wouldn't go to. And other big cities or some rural towns that I've been to in Australia that are quite sketchy. And the same is true in many other Western nations I've been to also. That's not the case in Taiwan. It seems to be an incredibly safe country. The only thing that's really unsafe here, I would say generally, is some of the driving. But in terms of people actually sort of going out of their way to be aggressive or violent to you, that's not really the case at all. It's a very, very safe country. What do I have next? The health system. The health system is really good. So you pay out of your wage or salary, and it's not very much. As I said, I think it's including the labour insurance part. It depends. It depends on how much you earn, but it'll be approximately $30 to $50 a month. And then you do have to pay when you go to a hospital or a clinic or something like that. But those fees are really low. So if you go to a local clinic, just near your house, it's $5 for a visit, and that also includes your medicine. And that's the same if you go to a dental clinic for a standard kind of checkup and clean. That's $5 also. If you go to a hospital and you have to see some sort of specialist, it's, let me just do the conversions, it's about $14 or $15, something like that. If you go through the emergency room, if I remember correctly, it's $30, something like that. It's not very much. And my father, both of my parents came out here in April, it's now July. They were here in April, and my father had kidney stones. He had to have an operation on his kidney stones to have them removed, and it was much quicker and much cheaper, though he had insurance. In Australia, they paid for it anyway. But it was much quicker and cheaper here. A much smoother procedure. He didn't have to see all these people, or he did, but he saw them all in the same location on the same day. And all of the experiences I've had in the medical system and the dental system have all been excellent. A lot of the doctors here, the majority, I believe, and also dentists, at some point they train overseas, and many of them speak English. quite well. So I've had really good experiences. I've had all sorts of different things. I had acid reflux once. I had to have my stomach checked out, and I've had to have a cap replaced on a tooth. I've had various sort of accidents, scrapes and bumps and so on. It's all been very good, the way they've dealt with me. The one area I would say is maybe just slightly lacking is sports medicine. Australia's a real kind of sporting nation, and so I think sports medicine is a little bit more developed there, though it's also much more expensive to actually see a physiotherapist or something like that. Here, you go and see a specialist doctor, and you have to see that guy every 6 visits, so that costs about $14 or $15 to see him, and then each time you go to see the physiotherapist, you won't believe this, it's only about $2 to go and visit the physiotherapist. The treatment is not as sort of hands-on. They hook you up to these machines and do different stuff, but nevertheless it's very cheap. So the medical system here is excellent. What else do I have? Okay, it's easy to get around both in Taiwan and outside of Taiwan. So Taiwan is not a very big country. It's basically one main island. There are a few smaller islands, but it's basically one big country. And if I remember correctly, it's 400 kilometers from north to south. So it doesn't take very long. It's mountainous in the middle, and basically everyone lives around the coastline. So there's a train line that basically just does a big loop, and there are some other little train lines, but it's basically one main train line that does a loop around the country, and that's very efficient, and it runs on time. It's cost effective, or it's cheap, all that kind of stuff. There's a high-speed rail on the west coast. There are buses, and what else? There are flights within Taiwan. It's actually not really worth taking flights in Taiwan because it's so small. You can get everywhere pretty quickly in Taiwan. Driving is not as good because there's a lot of traffic in many places, and the traffic can be a little bit a bit of a white knuckle experience at times. But nevertheless, it's easy to get around Taiwan. The trains are really clean and safe and all of that sort of stuff, and there's some nice scenery and so on in some parts of Taiwan. To get to the other little islands, you can take boats or planes. There are buses as well. I think I mentioned that already. And then to travel to other places, because of where Taiwan is located, pretty much within 4 hours you can be anywhere from sort of Korea or Japan in the north to China in the west, to basically all of Southeast Asia within 4 hours from Taiwan. So there are lots of places that are close to Taiwan in terms of having a vacation. If you want to go to Thailand or Vietnam or Japan or something, and they often have quite good deals with local carriers. So it's in a good location in that way. All right, what do I have next? All right, so the culture and the history. Taiwan has quite an interesting history. I'll try to sum it up really quickly. So there are Aborigines here, and then Chinese started coming here, I believe, around 300 or 400 years ago, though not that many of them. And then the Dutch came here, and then later the Spanish, or was it the Spanish and then the Dutch? I think it was the Spanish, then the Dutch. It was actually discovered by the Portuguese, but they didn't get it. And then more Chinese settlers came, and then the Japanese got Taiwan in a war with China in 1895. And they ruled for 50 years until the end of World War II in 1945. And then the Chinese Nationalist Party moved to Taiwan when they lost the Civil War, and have been ruling it ever since. Well, they've got democracy now, but basically that's kind of the history of Taiwan in a minute or less. And so they've had all these different influences. There's still some sort of Japanese influence with some buildings and architecture and some foods. Not really so much in terms of what people do or even speaking Japanese, but they're actually quite favourable to that part of their history. They don't look on it like many other places do, because the Japanese actually improved Taiwan. They developed Taiwan in many ways. So there's sort of an interesting mix of stuff you can go and see and do. And also, when the nationalists fled, they took a lot of the artifacts, the imperial artifacts from Chinese history, brought them to Taiwan. So the communists wouldn't get their hands on them. And the communists also, with their various mad ideas, most notably the Cultural Revolution, they really destroyed a lot of the culture in China. And so if you want to see temples and that kind of thing, Taiwan in many ways is a better place to see that sort of stuff. A lot of that stuff has been reconstructed in China. So the culture can be quite interesting here, and there's Aboriginal culture as well. On the east coast, they're very much into that, and you can go and see traditional dancing and festivals. There are lots of different festivals all the time in Taiwan, and you can go and see all of those things. So it's pretty interesting in that regard, and it's accessible. It's a kind of an easy way to do that because it's quite a modern and developed country in the main. So you can sort of get an Asian experience whilst still having a fairly developed experience also. All right, the next point I have is that Taiwan has some really beautiful nature as well, and it's often quite accessible. The original name given by Westerners to Taiwan, which was given by the Portuguese, was Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island. And we later just called it Formosa, which means beautiful. And it is really stunning. There's a big mountain range that runs up the centre of Taiwan with some quite tall peaks, actually. The highest peak in East Asia is in Taiwan. It's Jade Mountain, which is taller than Mount Fuji in Japan. And they have a number of very high peaks and national parks in Taiwan, and some really stunning coastlines as well. The northeast, there's one section in the northeast that has an absolutely amazing coastline. The west coast is a little bit blighted because it has quite a high population density and they industrialised it. But the east coast and the south are pretty nice, and some of the smaller islands off Taiwan are pretty beautiful as well. So you can actually get out and see this stuff pretty easily because it's so mountainous. All of the major cities are not really very far from mountains, and so you can get to mountains very quickly. If you're into hiking, it's really great. And it's really lush because 2/3 of the island is subtropical and the bottom third, the southernmost third, is tropical, so it's really lush, it's really green. So it's beautiful, and you can see animals. There are all sorts of animals here. Where I live is a small country town, and I can go 10 minutes from my house. There are mountains. They're right there. They're looming. I can actually walk to them in 10 minutes. But you can go up some trails up there and regularly see monkeys. Every time I go up there, just about I see monkeys. Formosa macaques, I believe they're called. I've seen deer. I've seen lots of snakes. They're not so exciting. Well, they're exciting, but not in a good way. Snakes, frogs, tons of really amazing butterflies in Taiwan. So there's some really beautiful nature that you can see here. And if you like cycling has become really big in the time that I've been in Taiwan. It was just starting to become big about 8 years ago when I came here. It's huge now, and all the time you'll see families and other groups of people cycling around Taiwan. And they have built some special bike paths for those people. Not in every area. Sometimes they have to ride alongside the other traffic, but it's really good for cycling. There's quite a variety of terrain and so on. So yeah, it's a really beautiful place. In places it's marred because of industrialization and so on, but there are some really amazing places. Even Taipei has a national park, basically in the northern bounds of Taipei, right at the northern outskirts of Taipei. You can get into a national park and climb a big mountain there. And most cities have something like that. All right, and the last thing I'll talk about, which is sort of related to nature, I suppose, is the fruit. It's kind of a strange one to mention, but the fruit in Taiwan is absolutely top-notch. It's really delicious, it's really fresh, and they have a really huge variety because of the the terrain and the topography and the climate in Taiwan. So it's tropical in the south, and in the north, in the mountains, they can actually grow things like berries because of all the different microclimates. And there are all sorts of really interesting fruits that I had never had before I came here. Dragon fruit, dragon eyes, lychees, guavas, what else have they got? Custard apples, jackfruit, all sorts of interesting stuff here. And plus a lot of stuff that's familiar. Not everything that you would get in the West, but all sorts of stuff. I have some fruit trees in my yard, which is really nice. So that's about it on the pros of living in Taiwan. I hope this has been informative, and I will now record and upload tomorrow the cons of living in Taiwan. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for listening.